Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will start at 1 minute past the hour, so I'll just allow a few others to join, and then we will get started. But thank you for arriving on time. Okay, we're just at 1 minute past the hour, and so I don't want to delay us any further. A big welcome to you all, and welcome to the Beat the Heat webinar covering Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Thank you for joining us here today to learn and discuss about one of the most pressing challenges facing cities globally. I'm Rashmi Ladwa with Arup, and I'm delighted to open this webinar being hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and technical partner to Beat the Heat, Arup, which is a global built environment consultancy with offices across the world. Now, for those of you joining that wish to enable the live captions function, if you select the three dots at the top of your meeting toolbar, you can select language and speech and turn on the live captions and select the language that you prefer to read this webinar in. So please feel free to do that and join the instructions on the screen. In the meantime, I will go through the agenda very briefly with you all today. So we will start off with an introduction to our UNEP host, Eleni Miravilli, followed closely by an icebreaker exercise. We hope to invite you all to participate both in the presentation and also in the question and answer section too. Then we'll look to go through the climate emergency framework, where we'll break this down into 3 different stages. And then we'll conclude and follow up with a question and answer session where, again, we invite you to ask questions to our panel of experts and learn from the experts themselves. So without further ado, I will introduce our UNEP host today, Dr. Eleni Miravilli, or Lenio, Global Chief Heat Officer for UNEP, UN Habitat and Atlantic Council's Climate Resilience Centre. So, Lenio, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first webinar that we have created together with Arup under the umbrella of Beat the Heat. It's an introduction to the whole program, and I would like to quickly introduce Beat the Heat to everyone that's here. It all started in COP28, which was in Dubai. And it's which is where UNEP launched the Global Cooling Pledge. And the Global Cooling Pledge is basically a science-based roadmap to reduce emissions from cooling and protect people from extreme heat. And this had a very strong political mandate, and it created important and strong political leadership. The co-chairs for this was the UAE as well as Brazil. So they were the co-chairs for them. These two countries were the co-chairs for the Global Cooling Pledge, which was also adopted by 73 other countries with whom we are working to help them actually move towards the targets of the Global Cooling Pledge, which are mostly national, but they include 3 subnational targets as well. And these 3 subnational targets have been shaping the way that we approach the work that we want to do with Beat the Heat. And they break in 3 different categories. The first category of actions has to do with mapping heat, mapping vulnerability, creating heat action plans, creating capacity within cities, prioritizing which actions are the most important, and kind of preparing to develop specific projects that can help cities deal with extreme heat. And then the second one has to do with passive cooling, which is all of the ways that we can cool a city without actually using energy. And it focuses on nature-based solutions and all other types of, as I said, all other ways that we can cool the public space, but also buildings and the environment with different design solutions mostly. And finally, the third one has to do, the final bucket has to do with procuring the right kind of active cooling solutions, which means basically sustainable cooling and high efficiency cooling technologies for public buildings. And this is, and also kind of creating design building codes, which also would probably overlap both active and passive cooling directions. This whole thing, the Bitte Heat, was created because it became clear that with the global cooling pledge, we could go only so far. We needed to engage cities to make sure that we implement heat resilience actions and actually initiatives on the ground. And this is why this implementation drive was created and designed between UNEP and the Brazilian COP30 presidency, and it was launched in Belém last November. So ever since, we basically closed the call. We had about 200 cities, 208, I think, cities from all around the world that expressed interest to participate in it. And also, importantly, we got about 100 different partners also express interest in participating. Partners from all very, very different partners, from multilateral banks all the way to local NGOs. And this is the first Beta Heat is the first large global effort to bring all of the players together and try to figure out how to best matchmake and create capacities so that we can fundraise, and we can also technically support cities in order to move forward with the plans that they need to do to deal with heat, which is rising and which is not getting any better. So let's see, my last there we go. My last slide is the upcoming activities. And the upcoming activities is that, first of all, we're going to send to all the cities. And this is really, really crucial. So I want very much to kind of impress to you how important it is to get responses for that. We'll send you a survey, through which it should be easy. It's multiple choice, through which we want to assess where cities are at, what is the level of preparedness, what kind of things have they been doing for heat, and what are the things that they want to prioritize. So this will be a survey that comes out at the end of January, and we're going to give cities a couple of weeks to get this back, because based on this, we're going to build the whole program. Meanwhile, at the same time as this is going on, we're going to have some capacity building and training sessions, of which this is the inaugural, and we want to thank Arup in advance for doing this with us and for setting it up. And we have a series of other partners that are lined up to do this type of, but different, everyone from his own perspective, this type of capacity building and explaining with cities how to take things forward, how to start planning, how to create like a methodology of an approach, assessing and also planning for building heat resilience. And finally, we're also going to have different cities that are in the forefront of this effort also create workshops with other cities. Paris was the first one to suggest that we do something like that, because it has created this exercise, which is Paris at 50 degrees. But also Paris has a lot of different things that we could learn from. So this is another kind of thing that we will be doing in the meanwhile as we build up a program, which we are hoping is going to be a 5-year program, and it's going to be quite robust. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dimple Rana and to Pasquale Capizzi. And Dimple is the head resilience leader at Arup and an expert in microclimate design with a strong focus on addressing urban heat challenges in cities. And Pasquale is an associate director at Arup, responsible for resilience and adaptation services. And he has expertise on a global level, has been working firsthand with a lot of cities around the world. So go ahead, guys, take it over.
Great, thank you, Lenio. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Dimple Rana, and I am going to be presenting for the first half of the webinar, and then I'll hand over to Pasquale for the second half. So firstly, to kick us off, I just wanted to go over the main objectives of the webinar today. So we've set out 4 objectives, and these are really the 4 takeaways that we'd like to leave you with at the end of this. So firstly, the webinar is about enabling engagement. So this means engagement with the Beat the Heat campaign. Lenio already mentioned some of the activities that are happening going forward. And I guess one of the objectives of the webinar is for you to understand where your city sits within this response to urban heat, and what do you want your forward journey to look like? So what are the sort of objectives and ambitions for your city, and how can you engage better with Beat the Heat going forward? The webinar sets out a clear framework for responding to heat, which is a 3A framework. Appreciate there's a lot of different frameworks going around. We've tried to keep this quite simple and keep some of the key messages in there. And it's all about learning and helping you build capacity around heat. So we hope that you'll learn a little bit more about urban heat data, tools, and the solutions. And then, of course, we appreciate that there's a number of different representatives from different cities here, but you've all got your own stakeholders and people that you speak to. So we hope you can take that material and share it with others as well. And we will make the slides available afterwards. So those are the main objectives. Before we kick off into the sort of technical content, we're going to start off with a bit of an icebreaker question. So you should see this coming up in either the chat or on your screen. And it's just a very simple question. Which climate hazard is the top priority for your city? We're obviously in a webinar about heat, so don't let that sway you. Please be honest with your answers, but we just want to get a bit of a feel of what the priorities are for yourselves. So yeah, we'll just give you a minute or so to fill that out. And I think once the answers start coming through, we should see that coming up. So I'm seeing at the moment quite a lot of people putting in flooding. I'll just give it another few seconds. And I think everyone should be able to see the answers as well in the chat. For me, it's just coming up on my screen. Okay, I'll let everyone sort of continue to answer this, but at the moment, I'm seeing sort of extreme heat is creeping up, which is interesting to see and certainly validates us having this webinar and having this campaign in the first place. And it's good to sort of hear that, extreme heat is really seen as a bit of a slow climate phenomena. And in some ways, it takes time for those impacts of extreme heat to be felt. But we're seeing that becoming more and more prominent as we go forward. So people are really starting to understand the sort of devastating impacts that heat can have on our cities. So to start off with, I'm sure everyone here is well versed in the sort of climate emergency and appreciates that we are in a climate emergency. We're seeing increasing temperatures every year, and over the last few years, we've seen temperatures that are record breaking and quite frankly are just not suitable for sort of human beings to be able to live in. So in some parts of the world, we've seen temperatures above 45, 50 degrees in some cities, sometimes even higher depending on where you are. In 2024 was the first year that we passed that 1.5 degree sort of average temperature above historical levels. I'm not sure what that looks like in 2025, but I'm sure those statistics are coming in. And that has led to many devastating effects around the world. We've seen a number of different weather anomalies. I think this is over the last year, just in July alone, we saw a number of flooding events, storms, typhoons, all of those things. And of course, we also saw heat events, so heat wave events, where we've seen record-breaking temperatures. We've seen an increase in the number of heat waves in cities and in non-cities as well. But our webinar today is about urban centres and cities. And, quite often our cities are experiencing higher temperatures than the rural surroundings. And this is due to something called the urban heat island effect, or the UHI. And this is really to do with the way that we design and build our cities. So we're increasing the amount of hard surfaces that we introduce in our cities through buildings, streets, concrete. All of these things absorb heat. We're reducing the amount of nature and greenery in cities. So, trees, planting, all of these things. And of course, many of our cities produce heat. So through vehicles, air conditioning, and through just rapid urbanization. And all of this contributes to the urban heat island effect. Our own studies at Arup showed that during heat waves, we can get up to 7 to 8 degrees Celsius higher in urban centres compared to rural areas. Other studies have found even higher, sort of 10 to 15 degrees increase in temperatures. So even if your background temperature is, 40 degrees, some of the temperatures in cities can be even higher than that. So it really is alarming. And that can be pretty devastating in the kinds of impacts that we're seeing around cities. So this is just a highlight of some of the things that we've seen. So we see impacts to people, to our critical systems and our infrastructure. We're seeing an increase in excess of loss of life, of an increase of health conditions related to heat. A decrease in well-being, so both sort of physical and psychological, a decrease in productivity, so conditions that are just difficult to work in both indoors and outdoors. Heat also impacts our ecosystems, biodiversity, our air quality. It impacts our infrastructure, so we're seeing downtime of services such as transport, utilities across cities. And overall, this has a big impact on the finances and the economics of cities. So we see lost revenues, loss in property values in some cases, and of course, increased costs when it comes to maintenance and repairs. So, and this is just a few sort of stats within the region that we're speaking to today, and appreciate it's a very broad region, and I know some of you are sort of stating where you are at the moment, but just so at the moment we've got people joining us from all over Europe, Middle East and Africa, and we see some pretty interesting statistics over the last few years. So in sort of cooler places like in Europe, in the UK, even if temperatures are not sort of exceedingly high, they still have an adverse impact because many of our cities are just not designed to keep the heat out. So for example, in the UK, we've seen an increase in temperatures over 32 degrees, which can have pretty devastating impacts. Across Africa, so in Mali and Burkina Faso, we're seeing the increasing likelihood of temperatures exceeding 48.5 degrees. I mean, that is a really, I can't actually imagine what that feels like on an everyday basis, but it certainly is not the kind of temperatures that human beings are designed to tolerate. And then overall across Africa, we've seen the average temperatures in 2024 have been almost a degree higher than sort of historical averages. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is much that we can do, and we're seeing cities around the world doing many amazing, inspiring things that we'll talk about today. And the framework that we've set out for responding to sort of this heat challenge is this 3A framework, which goes through analyze, assess, and act. So analyze and assess are really about understanding cities better. So collecting data, understanding what's happening, understanding where the heat is, and then interpreting that and prioritizing. And I think this fits in quite nicely with what Lenia introduced earlier when it comes to sort of some of the priorities around beat the heat. And then the second section, which Pasquale will talk about, is more about planning and implementation and real solutions. And again, we'll talk about nature-based solutions, passive solutions, all in line with our key priorities. So then jumping into the analyze section, this is all about understanding how to use data and tools to identify and interpret heat patterns. So we're trying to answer questions like, how is heat distributed in our cities? Where are the hot spots? Who's affected? Where are the vulnerabilities? What's causing that heat? And that understanding is really important as a first step before we can respond. But before we start, just the key message and just a caveat, data is really important. It helps us with our understanding, but we need to start where we are. Data is a challenge, tools are a challenge everywhere, and resources are a challenge. And you don't have to have perfect data to start. Use what you've got and supplement it with your own experiences and start there. You can always do something valuable. And data, as I said, it can be powerful, and there's many different ways that we can use data to understand heat around our cities, around the world. I just wanted to point out a couple of key examples. So many of you have probably seen heat maps. This is just a global heat map showing some temperature exceedances over the last year. You can also zoom into heat maps that look into a particular city or a neighborhood. And as I said, they allow us to understand where the heat is, where are the hot spots, where are the cool spots, and then sort of really interpret why that's happening. We can also use data to create different kinds of plots and charts, and this could be a really interesting way to compare different scenarios. So at the moment, what you're looking at is a comparison between different climate change scenarios and sort of heat wave events or heat exceedance events for different regions around the world. So you can see how much worse it gets under a worse climate change warming scenario. And there's different ways that you can compare different kinds of statistics. And as I said, we're looking for different patterns. We're looking to understand what's happening and really trying to get under the hood. There are a few different key data sources that you might want to really look at when trying to understand heat in your cities. So firstly, starting with climate and weather data. So of course, temperature data is really important, but also thinking about other variables. So things like humidity can be really important, solar radiation, windiness is really important. All of those things affect the way that we experience heat in cities. We can get data from lots of different sources, and we should be thinking about getting future climate change data as well as sort of present day or historical trends. Satellite data is becoming increasingly available. I think there's satellites going up all the time, and they can be really useful for us to understand various different things. So satellites like MODIS and Landsat in particular are really valuable. They allow us to get things like land surface temperature maps, which we can then use to create heat maps in city and again understand hotspots and cool spots. We can get data on things like land use in cities, so understanding what makes, what our cities are made up of. And then thinking about sort of vulnerabilities around cities and socioeconomics, understanding where the most vulnerable people, where the most vulnerable assets, buildings, systems are is really important. So getting data on things like population, so this could be health of the population, income, age, all of those statistics can be really important and informative. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of vulnerability and risk in the next section. And then lastly, many cities are collecting data more at a local level. So using sensors and monitor points, this can be really valuable to really zoom in and understand what's happening at a local sort of neighborhood level. And data is only really useful if you've got the tools to interpret that data and to understand what's happening. So we've put a few key tools here. I'm sure through this sort of Beat the Heat program, you'll be introduced to a number of other tools as well as you go on. But just wanted to point out a few things that are emerging and being used quite widely. So firstly, it's GIS platforms. So this is geographical information systems. This is a tool that's being used around the world, and I think expertise in using this tool are increasing and becoming more accessible. And it's a tool that allows you to visualize and analyze different kinds of data sources. So it's a great way to create some of those heat maps and also layer different kinds of data on top of those to create heat risk maps as well. We can also create dashboards where we bring in things like some of the heat maps as well as other kinds of graphs and charts. Dashboards can be interactive, so they allow you to probe the data and zoom in, and they also allow you to communicate to others, and including other stakeholders in the community. So they can be, a good device. And then there's also more advanced climate modeling tools. So things like advanced climate models, they have, I guess, historically been used by academics and researchers, but more and more they're becoming available to others, so consultants and experts that might be working closely with cities, which is great news because it allows us to fill in some of those data gaps using modeling techniques. And then there's other kinds of planning and design tools like microclimate tools, which have been used for a long time, but they allow us to zoom into cities and understand specifically what's happening maybe in a particular neighborhood or even within a building itself. So just a few useful tools that help interpret our data and turn that data into action. It's really important to acknowledge that, of course, with data, with tools and analytics, there are many challenges around these things. So firstly, around data integration, there's lots of different data from different sources, and trying to bring that all together can be a bit of a challenge. Trying to bring that all into one platform can be challenging. So we need to really think carefully about where we're getting our data from and how we sort of get it to speak to each other. And we could, I guess, approach things in an integrated manner. Data gaps and data quality is a big issue. There is not perfect data anywhere in the world. And I think sometimes if the quality is really poor, maybe we just don't use that data. Where we've got gaps, I think it's important to think about our own experiences of our city, our own expertise to try and fill in those gaps, maybe through community engagement as well. But as I said before, we don't have to have perfect data to do something. Resource constraints, again, are really important. All cities are constrained in terms of, people, funding, all of these things. And so trying to prioritize and think about what is important for your particular city is important when sort of looking at data and analytics. The future is uncertain, and although we have great climate change projections, what scenario you choose, what timeframe you choose, you need to think very carefully about that and how you plan for the future. And then lastly, equity and representation. I already mentioned vulnerability in cities. There isn't always good data on where the sort of most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable places are around cities. And again, we might want to supplement some of that data with our own local understanding, with community engagement. So it's all about kind of bringing all of those things together. So then a little bit of a case study just to show how we've used data and analytics. This is an example from Arup. So we've been developing a tool called UHeat over the last few years, which is an urban heat analysis tool that uses an academic climate model to create heat maps of cities and allow us to understand what's happening in cities a bit better. We did a research project a while ago called the Urban Heat Snapshot, where we investigated the urban heat island in the city centres of a number of different cities around the world. And this was for us to understand, what is the magnitude, what is the scale of urban heat island in different cities around the world, and where are the cool spots and hot spots and what's causing those. So these are just 3 snapshots from some cities that we looked at. So we've got Cairo, we've got London and Madrid. And we found that, urban heat island seems to affect most cities, no matter, even if they're smaller or bigger cities or different shapes. We do see some level of urban heat island everywhere. Some areas like Madrid, we found almost like 7 degrees difference in the sort of hottest part of Madrid compared to the coolest part. And this is just one point in time. And we found that quite often the coolest spots were where we saw more nature, so more greenery, blue spaces, all of those things. So I thought that was quite an interesting insight. So to finish off this section, just some of the key takeaways. As I've said, understanding of your city comes first, and that's really the first step when you want to respond to heat. It allows us to gain the insights that we need to enable targeted interventions. And of course, tools are really important to transform that data into action. And as I said, data does not need to be perfect. Start where you are, use what you've got, and you can do something positive. So then moving on to the assess section. So assess is really about interpreting that data and using it to prioritize action and thinking about how we layer that data with what we understand around vulnerability in cities. So the first message here is it's all about prioritizing and ensuring that we have a holistic, forward-looking assessment approach to ensure that we safeguard the most vulnerable people, places, and systems. And these are often the places that are most at risk. So what do we mean by risk in the first place? So the academic description of risk is that it's the probability of a given sort of consequence occurring, taking into account an understanding of the hazard, in this case heat, who's exposed to the hazard, and the vulnerability of the people and the assets. So it's very much a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And so just to kind of illustrate that with an example, if we take a neighborhood in a given city, which is suffering from urban heat islands, so say it's maybe 4 degrees hotter than its surroundings, and we have maybe a bus stop in that neighborhood where we've got a few people waiting, maybe we've got 3 people waiting, we have an elderly person, a child, and then a student. Out of the 3, the elderly person is likely to be the most vulnerable to the heat, because they're more likely to be affected by adverse impacts or health conditions. And then if they're sort of waiting for a while because the bus is late, then their exposure increases. So if you're in for example, a neighborhood where you don't have an efficient transport system, then you're likely to be more exposed than maybe in another neighborhood. So that increases the risk as well. So it just gives you a bit of an example, but of course the 3 components can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So just to touch on the sort of the consequences again, I went over this in the last section, but when we're sort of looking at doing a risk assessment, then we do need to keep in mind the various different impacts that we're looking at when it comes to risk. So this is just another overview, just showing you the different kinds of impacts when it comes to heat risks. So for a risk assessment, there's different levels of risk assessments that you can do, and they do vary in levels of complexity. So at the sort of highest level, you do a hazard screening where you look at whether heat is an issue in the city or if it's not an issue. So, one of the questions that we asked earlier was to identify your priorities in your city, and that's almost like a very high level hazard screening. We can go into another layer of detail where we then start thinking about exposure and vulnerability and that risk in general. And then we can start going into more levels of complexity where we think about maybe quantifying that risk or maybe giving it some kind of rating. And at the most complex level, we might look at sort of risk modeling and even bringing in some of those sort of analytic tools and modeling tools there. And what kind of screening you do really depends on what your priorities are, and I guess the resources available, so whether that's time or funding, etc. And it's about tailoring that to the needs. And the different kinds of outputs from an assessment can vary. So, for example, a qualitative output could be using some kind of rating level, which could be just a very simple scale for risk scores. This could be presented through a heat map, or it could be presented through a matrix. Maybe like a traffic light system is quite commonly used. And then a more quantitative assessment really looks at estimating sort of different kinds of quantities. So what we're seeing an increase of in the heat space especially is sort of quantifying financial losses, and looking at things like replacement costs, operational costs, and the benefits of various interventions. And also looking to quantify what is the cost of doing nothing. So what does that risk look like now and in the future? So just an example of some ways that we might quantify things financially, or using cost metrics. So some of the sort of impacts that I mentioned before. So we've got things like heat-related illness, we've got productivity loss due to heat, we've got degradation of transport systems, and also increase in energy demands. So those can be translated into cost metrics. So we could look at things like increased hospitalizations, loss in income. We could look at maintenance costs as well as energy costs and things like that. And as I said, these kinds of sort of economic evaluations are becoming more prominent, and I guess they do allow our cities, they give us, a bit more evidence to then unlock different kinds of financial mechanisms and funding and things like that. The other thing that's really important when you're assessing risks in your city and you're doing that kind of assessment is to think about the future. So we really need to kind of think about what does that risk look like in the future, so under different kinds of climate scenarios. And as I mentioned earlier, it's about choosing the appropriate scenario for your particular city and the appropriate time horizon as well. And the other thing to think about is, how is your city changing in the future? Many cities are growing. We're seeing an increase in urbanization. That's going to influence things like the urban heat island. We might be seeing increased developments, different things like that. So do keep those things in mind. And then what can we do with the outputs of these kinds of assessments? So as I mentioned, it's all about prioritization and thinking about what are the priority areas where you want to target solutions. So who are the priority people, the priority receptors, so the most sort of vulnerable. And then using that to identify adaptation interventions. And Pasquale, we talk a lot more about this in the next section. So thinking about where we target those interventions and what types of interventions we use. And then finally, where you cannot mitigate that risk using sort of heat solutions, think about what other kind of mechanisms there are. So this could be insurance products or policies, which again, we're starting to see a lot more of that when it comes to heat as well. Other climate hazards are a lot more advanced when it comes to some of these things. So then just an example of where a risk assessment has been carried out. So this was a bit of a holistic risk assessment for Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. This is a World Bank project. So Dar es Salaam are expecting to have their population doubled by 2050. And I guess that they were concerned with what impact that would have in terms of climate hazards, so things like risk of flooding, urban heat island, but also thinking about land degradation and soil erosion. So this study looked at holistic risk assessment. On the heat side, the study looked at understanding how the urban heat island will increase in the future under different climate change scenarios, as well as different kind of urbanization scenarios. And the sort of main sort of priority for the city was to look at how green solutions can be used to reduce some of those risks. So it's a really interesting project, and we put a link there. We will make these materials available later, but you can click on that link to learn a little bit more about this project. So then to finish off this section, some of the key messages. So as I said, heat assessments can be carried out at a number of different levels. And it's important to tailor that to what your needs. It's important to ensure those assessments are holistic, so they take into account social, environmental, and financial dimensions. They should be forward-looking and thinking about future climate change scenarios, as well as how cities are changing, and they should be action-oriented. And as I said, Pasquale will talk a little bit more about that in the next section. So we are halfway through the sort of technical section. We're going to take a sort of 5-minute break now, just so you can maybe get a drink, etc. And we'll leave you with a couple more icebreaker questions. So they'll be, again, popping up on your screen or in the chat. So the first question is around limitations that might limit your ability to carry out different kinds of risk assessments or heat assessments. And then the second question is around vulnerability and the sort of what you might recognize as the most vulnerable people, systems, areas in your city. Appreciate that, you know, many of you might want to tick all of these, but I think the poll only allows you to tick one. So yeah, we're just asking you to maybe prioritize that. So it's 10:38 in UK time. Let's come back at 10:42 and we'll do a quick look at what the polls are showing us, and then I'll hand over to Pasquale. Great, thank you everyone. So before I hand over, just wanted to have a quick look through the poll answers. So really interesting to see that data availability seems to be by far one of the biggest challenges. And in some ways that's really not surprising. So yeah, it's really interesting to understand, and then sort of followed by, I guess, tools and methods. So hopefully, through Beat the Heat, this is something that can help in terms of like technical assistance in these areas. So it's good to understand that better. And then when it comes to vulnerabilities, I think again, the most popular answer is public health. So I guess impact to people, which is very important indeed. And then followed by housing. And of course, yeah, many parts of the world, temperatures inside our buildings, inside houses are often much higher than outside. Okay, great. So Pasquale, if you want to take it away, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dimple. Thanks, Lenny, for the introduction. So I'll try now to take you through the kind of the natural consequences of analyzing, understanding what the risk related to heat is, and that is acting. So basically transforming what we know now into something that will reduce and mitigate the heat in our cities in the future. So really here, the idea is building on understanding to plan and manage that risk in our cities, and finding solutions which can be applied at different scales. So when we look into the possibilities of managing heat risk in our cities, we would typically look at a framework which we find quite robust and quite useful. So there's an element around awareness. We need to make our citizens, our policymakers, our utilities, all players in the city aware of the current and potential future increase of heat in our cities, and that concerns both, as Dimple said, the median increases, the average increase in temperatures, but also the extremes that we will face. So there's an awareness element. The second one is preparedness, because we know about this hazard, because we know this will affect or will influence our cities and everything in it, from the way we live to the way we design and build. We need preparedness. We need to invest on early warning systems, on resources for helping the managing of heat and cooling, on community-based response. So we need to really activate all the stakeholders in a city to be able to prepare. And finally, we need to design and redesign. It's true that in some countries today, as Dimple said, we have quite a wide range of cities and quite a large region. But it's fair to say that in some regions, 80% of the buildings that we have today will be still standing in 2050, which means you really need to look into retrofitting. We really need to look into the ways you redesign and rethink things. In other regions, this is not the case. You're still going for a rapid urbanization, so you have probably the opportunity to do it right. So what we look at turning all this understanding of risk into something concrete, we're typically looking at four main scales where we can actually have an impact and a positive influence. Our city scale, of course, and then going down the funnel, and neighborhood solutions, building solutions, or things that really are the object, the place we're living, and then at people and awareness and behavioral levels. So let's always think that our solutions need not to be confined to one scale, but need to cover a range of different scales of application. To be able to do that, there are two things which we think enable action. And as policymakers, as practitioners, as city representatives in this call, you know about that. But we really think it's important that we underline, on the one hand, the role of governance, and on the other hand, the role of policies, strategies, and other instruments. So first of all, the governance. So there is no way, in our experience and in our opinion, and for Beat the Heat campaign approach and perspective, that one single actor, say the municipality or the designer, will sort the heat issue. Such a widespread and transformational issue that we need all players in cities and beyond to cooperate to understand and mitigate risk in every areas of application of the solutions that I mentioned before. So public policymakers, public bodies, private organizations, planners, communities, they all need to be involved in a way or the other with their roles and mandate to mitigate the hazard. And this obviously will include the need for collaboration, for platforms, for institutional platforms, for cross-department work and cooperation and data sharing at any level. The second element, which we think it's still one of the crucial enabling conditions, is that we need to take heat as a policy action area. So we need to identify KPIs, we need to identify outcomes that we want to achieve, and use the entire range of policy instruments that we have in a country or in a city to anticipate the impact of it and mitigate and reduce effectively. That will concern standards, regulation, policy, strategy at all levels, and also legal instruments at one point. We need to look into several areas of policy here. There's a heat and heat island effect. So, for example, the percentage of impervious cities, impervious surfaces across cities, land surface temperatures. These are things that, in a way, belong to policy area, but then belong to zoning, to urban planning, and to design this type of work. Brownouts and blackouts during extreme heat events, duration, number, and causes, that's something we can cover through policy as long as we recognize it, we acknowledge it, and we take a deliberate action in our policy and standards to work on it. Energy demand, of course, which is one of the key issues that we've been concerned with in the last years, and we will probably be concerned more and more in the future. That is one of the key issues that we can have influence on policy, standard, and regulations where we design or we permit buildings. So there's a number of policy areas that need to be covered. So this takes me to an interesting case study. I've seen in the chat that someone from Lagos would be interesting later on to hear on the Q&A about this. But the first key point here is understanding that a city has got agency, has got the capacity to mitigate, to think heat, to think this hazard as something that can be managed in the future. To do that, for example, Lagos developed a state climate adaptation and resilience plan with the support of the Resilient City Network. And that was a strategy that addressed very significant problems for the city of Lagos, including sea level rise, extreme heat, and flooding for a large population, with a cost of inaction that was calculated to around 40 billion in potential damages. So we're thinking of a large scale of issue that needed to be sorted. So what the strategy did, in a way, the solution that brought forward is identification of a portfolio, which I think ranges around $9 billion US dollars of about 33 projects, which included all sort of technical solutions and community involvement solutions, such as early warning system, to be future ready and to mitigate that particular ranges of risk. And then identify the serial bankable solutions, I think on the range of 700 million to 1.5 billion a year in terms of US dollars. But what it did, and it transformed these into chunk size pilot projects and bankable projects that investors could actually take and implement. So what can we help? What can we learn in terms of application? Well, first of all, is the proactive capacity of policymakers in Lagos to treat this as an issue that needs to be planned for and regulated and managed. User data-driven prioritization. So what the plan did was basically identify key vulnerable areas that needed to go first and needed to be addressed first. The identification of flagship projects basically created trust and invited interest from investors, from other players, and this really strong push for a governance that cut across sectors and involved everyone. So that's one example. Another example that we have, and here can also talk about this later on, is what Athens in Europe, in Greece, did, which is basically addressing a key issue, which is the fact that this city is probably one of the hottest, or is about to be the hottest city capital of a European country in Europe, with very significant health risk especially for vulnerable sections of the society, like elderly, low-income people, and energy poor resident citizens. So, in terms of solutions, what this set of actions that Athens decided to take is quite interesting because it's probably one of the first cities in Europe, well, I also want to say globally, they're looking to a chief heat officer. So someone that will basically take responsibility to take these as well seriously, coordinate and cut across all departments so that it can be managed in a way. And then he entered into a series of action like heat action plan, which took these three buckets that I mentioned before, the awareness, preparedness, and redesign, and went through a coherent, consistent type of set of solutions to address it. So what can we learn? What I would take away from this case study? First of all, this idea of identifying a clear person, a focal point, a real governance kind of beacon within the city that could take it seriously and then make it one of the key issues in the agenda. Treat heat as a managed urban risk, not just as an emergency. So it's not about responding only to emergency and peak and extremes, but understanding that these peaks will be recurrent, as Steve mentioned, and therefore it's a risk that need to be measured, that needs to be managed proactively. And I think it's something that is extremely interesting to take away for discussion later on, or for you when you move to back to your city and to your work. I was really recently, literally last week, involved in facilitating a roundtable for this new strategy of the Vicenza city, which is a relatively small town in northern Italy, which brings something interesting to the table. First of all, this is a master plan that is being prepared to a strategic vision, which is most and foremost designed to regenerate and rethink the city from all angles, from housing, nature, economy, etc. The problem that is sorting here is that you have extremely recurring inundation and very significant heat issues. And what we did as a sort of solutions, it looked into several strategies. And one of them was looking at the incredible wealth of blue and green infrastructure that the city has at its disposal, and realized that these weren't really leveraged across the years. So what the strategy is doing now is basically looking at all the rivers, looking at all the blue infrastructure, all the green infrastructure, and basically turning this into a political vision for the future to rethink the city, rethink regeneration, rethink development and design and redesign with the clear angle of improving mitigating heat risk and inundations as a benefit, while also doing regeneration. So what I would really like to take away from this one is a political drive. There is a mayor here who really thinks that this strategy for rethinking the city is a strategy that needs to take seriously some of the natural hazards like heat and make regeneration in a way that these are addressed in the process. So when we think about policy, which is the first part of this kind of acting section and strategy standard, I think these are some of the takeaways I would like to conclude on before we start looking at the more technical and practical solutions that we have at our disposal. First of all, is this idea of building outcomes that can be shared across stakeholders and basically capture that in a strategy, in a policy that a city can stand behind, an investor can understand, and there is a coherent look into the future so that you can actually support it. The second point is really the ability to identify problems and establishing these causal links and metrics that say this is the problem we have with heat and we will have with heat in the future. These are the KPIs and this is what we need to achieve to mitigate this risk in the future. Integration with governance and policy, not only because there's a bit of a truism, it's obvious that we need to do that, but also because this organizes investment and basically gives finance a direction for implementing the long term. People, I'll follow through the second part of this presentation, right? Or do you want me to stop? No? Okay.
Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
That's a lot of information. I appreciate that, but there's a lot to say, to be honest. This is a space of action that we described would be at a different level. Now we're looking to, once again, the two other A's. Now we need the acting, and in the acting, even though we want something practical to show quickly. Planning and understanding where we're going and providing a roadmap for all of us in the cities, it's crucial. Now we're looking into some of the practical solutions that we can apply. One obvious area of work is buildings. Um, Buildings, as you can see on the left side of that diagram, are both in a way subject to the changes in climate and to the increase and exacerbation of the hazard levels of that, but are also cause of the urban Italian effect. So that's a natural area in which we can have an influence and transform the heat conditions of our cities. This is a publication that is about to be published by Arup with Saint-Gobain that looks into why we need to adapt and what are the solutions, especially from materials and technology systems standpoint to do that. That will be shared soon. But here is the key point. We're looking into both, which is just mentioned, the need to design and redesign. And what is crucial here, retrofit, what is crucial to understand here is that we need not to think immediately of very expensive solutions. There is a range of solutions that we can take in a lot of our cities, from increasing the albedos, which is the reflectiveness of the colors of our roofs and facades, to improved shading. And some of the examples I'm going to show now actually show ingenuity and the ability to make the most with little, but also the ability to transform the way we live and the comfort we have in cities. This is an example that we've been involved in Rasulabad, in Surat, in India. There was Arup with Roof Over Our Heads NGO and others from the local residents. The problem there is that you had a certain type of vernacular architecture, formal or informal, that was really focusing on tin and cement sheets and for both roof and walls, which amplifies heat inside quite a lot. And climate change, with the increase in temperatures in India, this is actually a serious, significant emergency. But you also are in conditions where investing on more expensive materials and insulated materials may be difficult. So what we did there was working with our own architects and engineers and the local community to identify a series of local materials, even recycled materials, that could help insulating tin and cement roof in a way that you could reduce heat quite affordably and quite effectively, and at the same time recycle and reuse some of the poor materials, so to speak, but very effective, that were in abundance in a way. So what we learn here, I think, to take away, is that we need not to think of extremely expensive or very difficult things to realize sometimes, solutions like triple glazing openings or robust thermal mass, etc. But we have other solutions, including this one, that can actually be thought out first before we go for the more sophisticated and costly solution. And that is planned for both the things we need to design anew and the things that we need to redesign and retrofit. The second example, which is obviously very different, but it takes another angle, which I personally find very interesting, is what the city of Seville, with the architect Jürgen Meyer and with our engineering in the past, did, which was basically thinking, how do we regenerate a public space in this city, which is not up to the quality it could be. It's a central public space. It needs regeneration. We are in a city that is already very, very hot and will become warmer and warmer and warmer in the future. So that's a shading project. It's in Plaza de la Encarnación. It was a neglected and underused space. Sevilla needed to revitalize historic space. So we basically looked into a series of co-benefits there. So improving the public space, improving the quality of the city centers, but also introducing an iconic wooden canopy that you see here, that will basically create a shade for a public space, attract tourists and attract interest and visual interest and aesthetics for that particular area, and at the same time provide shade and reducing heat and extreme and medium heat in a particular public space that then could be reused and lived upon and occupied by both the citizens and the tourist. So what you have here to take away is the idea of taking regeneration, especially if you need it, as both an opportunity to improve the quality, attract tourism, attract economy, etc., and at the same time mitigate heat and restituting this to your cities in different cities. Which is also an interesting thing that Paris tried to do. This is an example of what the city of Paris would within the climate adaptation and resilience strategy. So once again, you see how this is the practical application of a coherent longer-term plan that we mentioned before. Paris has extensively waterproof and asphalted schoolyards. It's very dense. There's a large distribution of a network of schools which play a public role in a way, but it's also extremely built up. You probably know from pictures, etc., how organic and how long-lived is Paris as a city, but also the fact that greenery it's typically enclosed in a fewer places. So here the project really looked into solutions which are relatively simple. So transform schoolyards, so public spaces in which you have agencies, into green, shaded, and permeable oases that not only play well for children during heat emergencies and in general, but also as an effect of redance will basically, at the scale of this is being developed, reduce the ambient heat in the city of Paris. So creating cool local microclimates. You also encourage community to access to schoolyards, which is very interesting. So basically restituting a public space to the public because it's a cool place that you probably won't find elsewhere. So you're basically creating, in fact, pocket gardens with an infrastructure, public infrastructure you have that everyone can use. So I think what I would take away personally is this idea of the co-design and community involvement, using your infrastructures to create cooling resources in a city and basically opening to the public. So we looked into planning, we looked into buildings. I think it's also interesting to see what you can do at a neighborhood scale. So it's slightly different scale. You have many options here, but if we want to kind of really summarize it into two main areas, is the ability and the opportunity to leverage and really unlock the power of nature as green infrastructure, urban greening, green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, wetlands and biodiversity corridors, ventilation corridors, which I'm going to show in a minute. And on the other hand, is what we discussed in a way, which is this idea of the high albedo reflective surfaces, which are not only belonging to buildings per se, but also public spaces and pavements, which can also be made permeable. We got many experiences in the world of brave, in a way, public authorities and brave municipalities that decide to remove pavements and transform actually impermeable surfaces into permeable surfaces, which requires political capacity and will to do that. So let me take you through a couple of examples. This is an example. It's not unlike the one on schools, if you want. It's an example in Freetown, where in Sierra Leone, where you basically have the municipality under the mayor Yvonne Akessoyer, who's really a champion of resilience in a way, and with the support of several partners, and to really end the city chief of heat officer. So you also have that part. And the problem there is that you have extreme heat in Freetown, but extreme heat in Freetown had a very significant consequence in a way on economic activities and the safety of people, especially women that were basically on market stands, etc. So very simple solution like shading covers in the outdoor markets in Calabar Town, Congo Market, but basically in different markets, will basically reduce UV exposure and reduce therefore heat exposure. This not only kind of improved in a way the ability of of people not to suffer or reduce their sensitivity to heat, but also in turn increase the capacity of people to stay out in the market, go out their businesses, and increase livelihood and economic outcome of all this. In addition, some of these cases were also solar panels, which basically meant that you could extend the time you stay in the open, not only during the warmer hours, which you couldn't afford before because of the risk, but also during the evening. So basically with a very significant economic positive co-benefit. So what we learn here, in my opinion, is this, again, the ability to do the most with relatively low cost and non-engineer simple solutions to reduce this. And it's really close relationship between mitigating hazards like heat and improving, as a result, economic and health conditions of people. At the neighborhood level, you also see, in a way, the role of urban planning and the regulations and standard I mentioned before. Like the example of Stuttgart is really interesting. Many of the cities in this part of Germany, in particular Stuttgart, lay in an area with very low wind, breeze, and wind dominance, which means that basically you have stagnant air and exacerbating heat issues. So what the city of Stuttgart did with their Department of Urban Climatology was basically looking into, first of all, developing a climate atlas, so looking into the data, looking at what the problems are, and then basically decided to solve the problem of the low wind speed and therefore the urban heat island effect with green ventilation corridors. So green ventilation corridors are in fact natural or naturalized corridors within the city, which improve the ventilation, which facilitate wind into the city and attract cool air from surrounding hills and basically freshen up the built up area. And these green areas and green build and these green corridors are actually protected in zoning and in land use, which means you're not treating these solutions as a development that you can do whatever you want with that, but you realize that thinking of green corridors within the city is in fact a nature-based solution, a technical solution to reduce heat. So what we learn here, in my opinion, is the strength and the capacity to influence positively a city with standards, with the capacity we have in urban planning and design. As long as you recognize you have a problem, you have some data to prove it, and then you have the ability to prove to the developers and to your active economic society that these are in fact green multifunctional corridors need to be protected and enhanced. This is a city of Milan, which shares some of the issues with Stuttgart in a way, because you also have an issue with ventilation. Milan sits in a plain south of the Alps that in fact is one of the fastest warming geographical areas in the world, with very low ventilation and high pollution. Well, it is also, a city that's been growing over years in a very dense and impermeable fashion, so to speak. So the university, with the city of Milan and plenty of other partners and foundations around foresting, decided to basically increase the coverage of forest, urban forestry into the city, looking into some of the permeable surfaces and turning into permeable surfaces, and basically planning to plant 3 million new trees and shrubs by 2030, which is a very ambitious thing to do in a city that is already permeable, already established, with a very dense urban built environment fabric. I don't want to use up all the time, so this is my last case study in a way, but it's also an interesting one, although similar to what we've seen before, which is in addition to the school, the city of Paris is also looking at a neighborhood level to identify a series of areas where spaces can be cooled. And again, it's a relatively simple technical solution, which is focusing on one of the strategies of heat management in the built environment, which is simply shading. So adding trees, vegetation, urban furnitures and shading, and permeable surfaces in critical spaces means that Parisians, in a way, will be able to find oases throughout the city that are cooler in the heat. And the idea on the policy again is that everyone has the right to have a 7 minutes walk to a cool space, which I also think is a very interesting thing to take away. So I would basically summarize these findings here, Dimple, and I think we're going on to the last section of our work. First of all, we got different scales through which we can and we should mitigate risk of heat. So it's not only planning, it's not only building, it's an alliance of scales, it's an alliance of players that need to be involved in that. That to me is a key word to take away. There must be an alliance. Some of these alliances will need to be forced through regulation, for example, on new development. Others will have to be basically facilitated through collaboration and genuine collaboration, for example, with communities. It's extremely important that we don't focus on a long-term picture, I think, without achieving anything in between. I think we have plenty of quick wins. You've seen how many tactical solutions, like cool spaces, which don't take a lot of money and are not too hard to develop, but that create that confidence towards a larger transformation of our cities into cooler and less built up and less dense areas. And this is ideal point is prioritizing passive nature-based solutions because of all the co-benefits they yield. Talking of co-benefits, to me, this is incredibly important. In many cities and in many countries, definitely in Europe, but also in other regions that we're talking about here, we went for the last 10 years through a process of greening buildings and looking into energy efficiency and to reducing carbon and other things. These are all things that are co-beneficial to the achievement of a cooler city, etc. So the idea here is to identify where the co-benefits exist, and when they do exist, really enhance it, really protect it, and unlock the co-beneficial capacity. And finally, once again, we've repeated it many times, but I think it needs to be repeated again, is this idea that no single player will start or will beat heat on their own. We need a collaboration across stakeholders. With that, I think I'll probably just give a few final remarks, and then I think we will open the floor, right, Eleni and Dimple? But so I think just to finish up on this, I think to me the clear message, or the message that we would like to be extremely clear, is that heat is not the only natural hazard. We've done this icebreaker before, but it's one definitely that will transform our cities, and it will transform these cities in two ways, in my opinion. One is, in a way, obvious if you prefer, is the idea that you have heat waves, and people, especially the elderly, the children, are extremely vulnerable to it. But at the same time, you also have a transformational, discrete, long-term increase in temperatures that changes everything we do and design in cities, from the comfort we can obtain in buildings, which are typically designed to keep our core temperatures around 23 degrees ambient, so that we can keep at 37 degrees, right? But this will be more and more difficult and more expensive in terms of energy if we don't do something. So there's both extreme and medium. And that's important that we keep it as a key issue. The second point I think we want to again underline is this idea that you want to analyze, assess, and then act. So you got these three elements, finding the data, understanding what the data means, and then basically taking actions based on that. And that is made through a clear, long-term, coherent thinking and planning, and very practical solutions at any scale. There is a bit the hit campaign, and that's why we are developing these webinars. And you need to look at UNEP and others as a resource, and I think they will come back to you to offer more support. I think there will be a specific questionnaire for that. So you will find that many of the things we said can actually be taken in your cities, on your context, with the help of UNEP and others. That's just the start of a journey. This is really self-explanatory. I think that we talk about buildings, about infrastructures, we talk about many things, but the key point here is that we have segments of our societies that are disproportionately affected by the heat, which is extremely vulnerable, and these are the ones I think we have responsibility to protect in the first place. And thank you for your attention.
Amazing. And so I think we want to open the floor for questions now. So if you have any questions, it'd be amazing if you could post them into the chat, or if you feel comfortable enough, then please raise your hand, and you can say your question out loud. So I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to post some questions, and I can see we have some hands raised. So maybe I'll go to those people first. Let me just check. So shall we go first to Sadatu Baba? Would you like to take the floor? I believe you're still on mute, so let me just double check and see.
I think you should be able to unmute yourself now. So
unless that was a hand in error, I'm not sure. So maybe we'll move on.
I think it's Anna next.
Anna next. Thank you. Over to you, Anna.
Anna Romero.
Good morning. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. So thank you all, because it was really interesting. It's our first time in one of these Beat the Heat sessions from the Barcelona metropolitan area. And just to make a little appointment, we are at 36 municipalities, Barcelona and 35 more municipalities, speaking about 3.3 million inhabitants, just to have an overview. So our question was directed to finance, because we are very worried about how do we manage to produce all these solutions, all these prismatic solutions, because as you were mentioning, there are a lot of co-benefits also that are very important. And we are interested in knowing if some of the experiences that Pasquale Capizzi presented were sponsored by privates, because we are looking for alliances with the private sector, with commerce, retailers, industries, or others, just to make this obvious need shared between all of us. Thank you.
And Pasquale, did you want to take that one, or?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to take more, or do we want to?
We could start with that question, and then we'll move on to the others. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take that one. Starting from finance, yeah, some of the examples had a participation of the private sector, but I think the key point for me is that we shouldn't look at private sector as a source of funding in a way that private sector will finance something. I think is sorry, I need to drink a glass of water.
That's okay. Sorry, put you on the spot there, Pasquale. Yeah, I think I mean I'm not 100% sure about the examples that Pasquale presented, but there are definitely other examples where there have been collaboration between public and private sectors. So I think the Cool Roofs New York program is a really good example of collaboration between different departments within sort of New York City, but then also private sector as well. And it's very much like you know, they brought in different kinds of co-benefits that are wider. So it was largely a voluntary program, but also a program where they had sort of skills development. So they trained people in managing kind of cool roof retrofit program and things like that. So it's about upskilling. They collaborated with the universities as well and got students and local volunteers to just go up there and paint roofs. And that's one of those kind of quick win, simple solutions. But over the course of 10, 15 years, I think they've rolled out cool reflective roofs across much of New York City. So I thought that was a really nice example of where it is collaborative and how funding has been unlocked. Yeah, I don't know if Pasquale, you're okay to come back, otherwise we can, yeah.
That
Are
was
you okay?
untimely.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I guess what I want to, yeah, I agree. I mean, there's definitely examples of where this happens. But I think the key point here is that the private sector is but one of the players in that. So if a public infrastructure, sorry, public authority needs to invest a budget that we know this is all limited, and I think you know better than anyone. And then there's only so much you can do. But we have instruments like the implementation of public-private partnership, regulation, where you actually force is not the word I want to use, but I think you invite private developers and um, who are investing in design, redesign, and in land betterment to do things the right way. So we are personally exposing many of these developments in which the discussion is we can do that new infrastructure, like for example a stadium, which is an example I've been involved in recently, in which the surface just in front of the stadium can be designed to be permeable or impermeable. The facade can be with a high or a low SRI ratio, so it could radiate a lot or radiate less, etc. It's a mix. You can force or you can invite the developer and designer to do the right thing, and that's in the public authority capacity to do that. And then you can also ask the private sector to do their bit in terms of investing in small infrastructure, investment and improvement wherever they are. But I think to summarize, I think we have the public-private partnership where we find incentives, taxation, land use, any type of incentives to invite private sector to participate in that large strategy of cooling in a way. Regulation, what we basically force again or induce the right thing into anything that is happening. And the third is the collaboration and the volunteering around a number of things we do that will need to come up from the bottom. So in a nutshell, and the fourth point, which is very important, is that these strategies, like for example, one for labels, when you look into bankable projects, when you look into showing the return for particular investors in doing a thing in a certain way, are also an extremely effective way to do that. As long as you have a plan, you have a master plan, you have a policy, you have a goal, a strategy, a vision, and then basically all the actors, including the private sector, can fall behind. So to summarize, I don't think we have a silver bullet to say, yeah, the private sector will put money on there, but we definitely have a number of instruments to make sure that happens. That's what I learned from the case studies.
Thank you, Pasquale. And just on that last bit that you said about bankable projects, I guess some of those cost metrics that I presented earlier, I mean, this is still kind of early thinking when it comes to the impacts of heat. I guess it's less easy to quantify those. But as we start getting more experience in understanding what those impacts are and what the cost is of doing nothing compared to some of these solutions, we might start seeing that there's more sort of bankable investment cases to unlock some of those solutions. I think, was it Satu or Sadatu, sorry. If you cannot unmute your mic, then you could try and type your question and
I can unmute now.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. And I was just wondering how academia and researchers can get involved. Because, for example, here I work in a university in a city in Nigeria, northern Nigeria. And we just recently formed a new research group focusing on heat adaptation. And my city, Kaduna, like so many other cities, there's a little or no policy focus on heat. So I was really interested in hearing how to engage policymakers. So of course, we don't have any heat action plans. And as part of our work, we're considering hosting an exploratory workshop to bring together policymakers and urban planners and maybe other key stakeholders as well to make the case for heat, as Pascal said, as a policy action area. So, so I just wanted, my question is based on your experience with other cities. smaller cities, I would say. What would be your recommendations for first engaging the policymakers, and then maybe how to structure that initial workshop or convening to move from awareness to getting them to commit to developing a heat action plan? So we've thought about bringing them together, but I just wanted maybe some recommendations on how to go forward with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question. I wonder if this is a good one for Lenio, for yourself, just getting the benefit of your experience there. I think you might need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
That's a great question. I think that cities need to work closely with universities and research centers, and help also research centers organize their data and their research around questions that cities pose. And it's great to hear, Saadatu, that the university itself is already creating by its own a possibility for kind of more actionable research that can be used. There's a lot of ways of pulling this together. As you said, you can create some kind of conference or some kind of workshop that you invite people from the municipality and present specific data that you guys have come up with and urge policies, bring different policies, international examples of policy linked to similar types of findings, and kind of urge them how to do it. Another thing is other cities, through universities or researchers, have actually created a series of guidelines that which then they call them the municipality to present it to them and to ask them if they could, for example, vote for these guidelines in the city council. It's really important to bring other parts of the city as well into these events, because you need witnesses and you need the people to start understanding that these are important, because the people will actually, it will put some pressure to the policymakers to actually do things, because often policymakers say yes, 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 and then they do nothing. So you have to create the movement and the knowledge and the awareness in the population as well. And so it would be great, and we've seen from cities, like often researchers work with NGOs and, for example, spokespeople and people that work with vulnerable populations. So you try to create what's it called, a front of different people that work together from, the academia and the research sector, but also bring together, if you can, a couple of private sector, which would be amazing, and some people from communities, and create more of a front, ideally, and then kind of move to invite with all these people, the policy people, so they feel a little more pressure. This is my first reaction, but this is a great question, and we can think about this more, and maybe kind of create a little bit more of a possibility to talk to universities and researchers about how to engage with policymakers better. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Lenio. I think we're on at the end of the time, but we've got time for maybe one more question. I think there's one more hand up, so maybe a quick one before we close out. So I think the hand
Also,
up.
I suppose we can facilitate also this process through UNEP and the work
Oh yeah,
that
that's a
we're
good point.
doing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think we've got Musima, who's got their hand up. And I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last one, just because we've run out of time. But we've got contact details that we've put on here, so if you've got any further questions, do get in touch afterwards. But do you want to maybe say your question, Musima?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Gilles Musima from Douala for Cameroon. And really interesting presentation, and it takes in charge, it touches all the context in which we are really found. So I will definitely look forward to maybe have more information on presentation on the part concerning Lagos, because we definitely have the same difficulties, flooding, heat, and so many other things. But I think Lagos touches Douala 4 and contains Douala 4 directly, because it is the same difficulties that we have, the same things that we are fighting here concerning the environment there. The thing is that in Cameroon, it is of recent that decentralization really occurred, because at first it was the government that was in charge of everything, even the environmental issues. But knowing the difficulties that they were also facing, it wasn't that easy to implement environmental issues or to tackle environmental issues in cities. So it is of recent, less than 10 years, that decentralization became effective in Cameroon. So now we are asked to take action to fight to combat the climate issues. So that's the reason why we are out to learn definitely. And when I saw the presentation concerning Lagos, I said, come on, this is the same difficulties that we are facing. If we can maybe have more information to know how they did, what they actually did, so that we can maybe copy, because it's a matter of collaboration between cities. That's what will bring us out of this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Seema. I'm not sure if there was a question in that. I'm afraid your audio was not very clear. So maybe we can follow up with you afterwards. And if you do have a specific question, do get in touch, and we can answer that afterwards. But we are at 11:32 in the UK here, so we're a little bit over. So I think we may have to finish there with the questions. But as I said, please do get in touch if you do have more questions. I'll hand over to Lenio then, just for closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
I want to thank, yes, sorry guys. I want to thank everyone. I want that were here with us, that participated and followed this very interesting webinar. And particularly, I want to thank Arup for putting this thing together. Guys, you were great. Thanks for the presentation. Please, I want to ask the cities to please feel free to send us any questions or any suggestions or any comments that would help with this. But most importantly, I want to urge all the cities, when you get the survey from us, which will be by the end of this month, the last week of this month, I think around the 28th or 29th of this month, please make sure to answer it so we could follow up with more meaningful work and matchmaking with you and partners. Thanks again. Wonderful to have you all here, and have a great day.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Lenio. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.